You know that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach when you wake up after a night of alcohol-fueled debauchery and experience a deep regret over your actions? Well, take that feeling and multiply by 1,000,000, and you might understand how I felt after my drunken one-night stand with Lily. The pleasure I experienced that evening was immense. On looks alone, she was my dream woman, and physically, the experience of making love to her was ecstasy. But even in my intoxicated state, I realized I was making a terrible mistake. Still, it wasn't until the cold light of day that the full consequences hit home. I woke up alone in my bed, as Lily had presumably left quietly like a thief in the night. My head was pounding due to my intense hangover, but this was the least of my worries, because I knew Lily had tricked me once again, taking advantage of my vulnerable state following the deprivations and horrors of the labyrinth. And once again, I'd been weak, giving in to my desires and worse, because I'd allowed her to take another piece of me. There was no point in denying the truth any longer. I was in league with the devil, forced to serve his evil agenda whilst guiding twisted mortals through the various hellscapes that exist beyond our earthly realm. When I was first pulled into this living nightmare, I thought I could still find a way out. I truly believed I'd be able to fight the system from within. But as I lay in bed that morning, I felt completely empty and defeated, hating myself for what I'd done. Lily left me be for the next week. I didn't bother going into the office during that time. In fact, I hardly left my apartment over those 7 days and nights, except to visit the local liquor store. I'll admit to wallowing in self-pity during that drunken interlude, having hit rock bottom. And the nightmares were worse than ever. I think Lily used our physical intimacy to infiltrate my subconscious. I'm sure she could control my dreams like some kind of twisted puppet master. She knew all my memories and could manipulate them at will. Sometimes she appeared as a loved one, such as my first girlfriend or even my mother. Other times she'd take the place of a childhood bully or abuser. She could take me into the light or to the darkest of places, darker than even the deepest caves in the labyrinth. That was the most terrifying part for me, waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night and realizing that even my inner, most thoughts weren't my own. And so it was hardly a surprise when I woke up on the couch one morning to see her sitting over me, her red hair flowing and her deep green eyes looking down upon me with a mixture of disgust and concern. "Wow, George, you look like hell," she pronounced without even a hint of irony. "You would know," I answered sarcastically whilst dragging myself up and slowly regaining my senses. My apartment was a mess, with empty liquor bottles and fast food wrappers spread across the floor. And my physical state was probably even worse, since I stank to high heaven, with my eyes bloodshot and several days' worth of stubble on my chin. But Lily didn't seem repulsed by my condition, and there even seemed to be a hint of sympathy in her voice. "I should really be offended," she added with a faint smile. "We have a night of passion together, and you need to go on a week-long bender to forget." I shook my head in disgust, refusing to meet her eye as I muttered my scornful response. "You know what you did to me?" Lily sighed aloud and rolled her eyes. "You know, George, I'm getting real tired of your shitty attitude. You've been given everything you ever wanted, and still you're not happy." Suddenly, the tone of her voice became deeper and more aggressive. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she demanded. A surge of fear went through me, and I did as told, looking into her intense green eyes and once again finding myself entirely helpless. "You think I'm the bad guy in this story," Lily continued in a softer tone, "but I'm actually trying to help you, George. Just remember, I'm the only one standing between you and our mutual employer, and you don't want to get on his wrong side. Believe me." A cold chill ran through me as her words hit home. I knew who Lily was speaking of, even though I'd never met him in person. But the mere mention of this evil entity terrified me. "Anyway, there's no time for this," Lily continued. "You need to get yourself cleaned up, George. I've got your next assignment. Meet me downstairs in 15 minutes and wear warm clothes, a heavy coat. You'll need it." I nodded my head meekly, standing up on shaking feet as I made my way to the bathroom. I'll admit that having a shower, shave, and changing into clean clothes made me feel just a little more human, although I still had a pounding headache, not to mention the sickness in the pit of my stomach. I walked down to the street and found Lily waiting for me in a luxurious dark limousine, which was very conspicuously parked opposite my apartment building. I got in, the door shutting as if by magic behind me. The organization had spared no expense with our transportation, sending a chauffeur-driven luxury car with tinted windows, leather seats, and even a fully stocked minibar. Lily smirked whilst looking into my still bloodshot eyes. "I'd offer you a drink, but I think you've had enough already." I scowled in annoyance, impatiently bringing the conversation back to business. "Why don't you tell me about this latest job?" I asked. I didn't particularly want to hear the details of whatever hellscape they were throwing me into, or the sick individuals I would inevitably be stuck with. Nevertheless, based on my previous experiences, I reckoned it was better to go in prepared. Lily smiled with feigned enthusiasm as she answered, but I swore I could see a glint of anxiety in her green eyes, which was certainly a first. "Well, George, today we've got something very special planned. You will accompany a party of our employer's most devoted followers, a faction which has certainly paid their debt in blood." She paused to let those last words sink in. I had a good idea of what Lily meant when she spoke of payment in blood. Immediately, my mind went to human sacrifices, to ghastly murders made on behalf of the Dark Lord. The mere thought brought an icy chill down my spine. "Who are they, and where are we going?" I demanded. Lily appeared thoughtful for a moment before answering, as our limo drove on. "In addition to being loyal and important supporters, today's party are a religious order of sorts, and today they'll be taking part in a most unholy pilgrimage." Lily's vague description conjured yet more dark images to mind, those of a satanic cult. But evidently their pilgrimage wasn't to Rome or Mecca. "This is a big day for you, George," Lily continued, although I noticed her voice was shaking. "Today you're finally going to meet our employer. We're sending you down to head office." I shook my head in disgust, the fear rising from deep within me as I considered the terrifying implications. I should have responded with angry defiance, but unfortunately, the fight had been knocked out of me, and so I was reduced to begging. "Please, Lily, don't make me do this. Anything but this. I don't know what response I expected from the demonic lady. Did I really think she'd let me walk away from this, after everything she'd already put me through? I suppose she might have laughed in my face in open mockery, or reacted with rage, unleashing the demon within her to intimidate me into compliance. But she did neither, instead appearing to show sympathy as she touched me gently on the shoulder and spoke softly in my ear, reminding me of the night of intimacy we'd shared together. "I'm sorry, George, but you know I can't do that. You need to do as I say, to follow the rules to the letter. Give our master the respect he's due and all will be fine." I looked into Lily's eyes and truly believed she was being genuine in that moment. But how could I be so stupid? Surely this was just another one of her tricks. I recoiled from her touch and broke eye contact, staring straight in front of me in a deliberate attempt to shun the woman. "She isn't a person," I reminded myself. "She's a damn monster." The rest of our journey was driven in silence. We arrived at our destination about 10 minutes later, having traveled to an affluent location in the city center. The limo doors were opened for us by a uniformed valet with dead eyes and a painted-on smile. I watched as Lily confidently strode out of the vehicle, her heels clicking on the pavement as she walked. We'd arrived at what appeared to be a luxury hotel, with a drop-off area out front and a substantial, grand lobby set behind glass swing doors. If this was indeed a hotel, it was not one I'd ever frequented before, and there was no business name above the front door. Naturally, I was suspicious and wondered what purpose this building served for Lily's nefarious organization. I sheepishly followed in Lily's footsteps as we entered the establishment and were hit by an intense heat. I paid little attention to my surroundings inside the lobby, but did note the extravagant decorations, with the floor and walls tiled with the finest marble, and finely crafted but bizarre, and frankly disturbing, sculptures in prominent positions. I ignored the decor as I followed Lily, glancing at the receptionist, a foul-faced woman with looks that could kill. We exited the lobby and sped down a carpeted corridor before reaching a lavish bar area, adorned with hideous paintings of grotesque scenes of death and torture. What type of establishment was this? I asked myself, and I soon got an answer of sorts. A sinister group were sitting and standing around the bar, laughing like hyenas as they downed their drinks. I counted 13 in total, men and women of different ages and racial backgrounds. All were dressed in thick black robes and should have been boiling alive inside of this well-heated barroom, as I was in the heavy winter coat Lily insisted I wear. The clothes on their backs made the 13 look like a party of monks, but they were unlike any religious group I'd ever seen. The jovial conversations ended as soon as we entered the room. The group paid little attention to me, Barr shooting me suspicious and hateful glares. Lily was a different prospect, however. The cultists' eyes lit up with a mixture of glee and excitement once they saw her in the flesh. They stood in respect and greeted her, although I noted how none would meet her eye. None except for the man I guessed was their leader. I watched as the figure rose from the bar and confidently strode over to meet Lily head-on, offering her his bear-like hand whilst flashing a crocodile smile. The cult leader was huge, at least 6'5" tall and well-built. He was bald-headed but sported a neatly trimmed goatee beard, and his eyes, well, unfortunately, he had a look which had become all too familiar to me over the last few weeks. Those eyes were focused, predatory, and devoid of any trace of a soul. I was intimidated by his presence, but Lily had no such reservations as she stepped forward and took his hand in friendship. "Lily," the man proclaimed, "aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" "Kane," Lily replied as she obviously knew the man. "It's a pleasure as always." The cult leader's smile faltered as he glared aggressively in my direction. "Who's the kid?" he asked. Lily glanced back at me, smiling sympathetically as she answered. "That's George, the new guy on our team. We're showing him the ropes so he'll be accompanying the party on today's journey." Kane spat out in anger. "This is a holy pilgrimage, Lily. We will not tolerate the likes of him when we meet our Dark Lord." Lily shrugged her shoulders but met Kane's eyes as she unveiled just a small part of the demon which dwelt within her. "I'm sorry, Kane, but these orders come from the top. Our employer wishes to meet George in person and insists he takes part in your pilgrimage." Kane's anger soon faded away, replaced by a fake and insincere smile. "Well," he said whilst looking in my direction, "if our Lord wishes to see this man, he must of course accompany us. I just hope he doesn't prove a disappointment." I heard the implied threat behind his words and realized Kane was a dangerous man. But I reckoned he would be the least of my concerns once we crossed over. No one bothered to introduce me to the other 12 cult members, and I never learnt their names. In my memory, they tend to blend into one, a dozen twisted smiles and hateful pairs of eyes. I didn't give a damn about any of them, and secretly hoped they would fall foul of whatever horrors we would encounter on our journey. In any case, I didn't have to wait long, as Lily commenced the now familiar ritual, speaking the cursed words and using her dark magic to summon a portal to hell. The swirling crimson vortex burst into existence at the far end of the bar. A wave of hot, rancid air shot across the room, so powerful that it knocked glasses off tables. I watched as the barman fled from the scene, his eyes wide with terror. But Kane and his people held no such fears, their cruel eyes lighting up in anticipation as they approached the portal, stepping through one by one. I noted how Kane waited until the end, allowing all his followers to cross over before him. I found this curious but didn't think much of it at the time. Soon all 13 had entered the vortex, leaving only Lily and I left standing in the bar. I stood still, frozen in terror at the prospect of yet another hellish odyssey. Glancing across at Lily, I saw how she met my eye as the rancid air hit us. And to my surprise, she held out her hand for me to take. "Come on, George," she said softly. "It's time." I was genuinely surprised because Lily hadn't accompanied me on my previous assignments. I hesitated, racking my brains for any way out of this. But I knew all too well the consequences of noncompliance and reckoned I'd stand a better chance of survival over there if I had Lily by my side. And so I took her hand, feeling the warmth of her palm as we stepped forward together, leaping into the vortex and being thrust through the dark void between the mortal and immortal realms. I awoke suddenly thanks to a hard slap across my face. The freezing cold hit me straight away, my whole body shivering as I slowly opened my eyes. I saw Lily standing over me and took her hand as she pulled me up onto my feet. Everything around me was chaos. The ground below me a thick layer of ice, as freezing wind and sleet hit me from all directions. But the cold weather soon faded from my mind as my nostrils picked up on the metallic smell of blood, and my ears were assaulted by the terrible cacophony of screams and roars. I looked past Lily and through the curtain of snow to witness a horrific scene. A giant stood in our path, a humanoid who was easily 20 foot in height. He was dressed in furs made from an unknown creature, a coat which barely covered his huge chest and bulging muscles. He stood on two sturdy legs as thick as tree trunks, and his chin was covered by a bushy, unkempt beard. But I couldn't ignore the wild, murderous look in his dark eyes and the huge club in his hands, a weapon covered in blood, flesh, and shards of bone. For below him on the ice were the mangled, crushed bodies of three people, their skulls cracked open like eggshells, and their bodies stomped into the frozen ground. Their corpses were now beyond recognition, but I guess the dead were cultists, pilgrims who'd unwittingly stepped through the portal and been instantly slaughtered by this monstrous being. The giant's eyes narrowed as he saw me through the ice and snow, and he unleashed a blood-curdling war cry before charging towards me, raising his club as the ground shook beneath his mighty feet. I screamed and recoiled in terror, falling to the ice as I made a frantic attempt to escape, but thankfully I was beyond the monster's reach. I watched from the frozen ground as the giant's charge was brought to an abrupt halt. Now I noted the thick iron chains wrapped around the giant's waist, securing him to the mighty rocks behind. The beast screamed in angry frustration, waving his blood-splattered bat in my direction, whilst grinding his yellow teeth. I didn't know what to do next, but thankfully Lily took control, stepping forward and placing herself between me and the giant. In the end, she only needed to utter one word to end his rampage. Enough! I was astonished to see the rage in the giant's eyes diminish, instantly replaced by a mixture of fear and shame. Lowering his head, the monster stomped back towards the rocks, turning his huge back to us and allowing Lily and I to pass unopposed. Still in shock, I was shivering due to a combination of my terror and the bitter cold. I turned to Lily, who had retained her cool composure and was seemingly unaffected by the low temperatures. "What the hell is that thing?" I asked, whilst keeping a weary eye on the now distant giant. "That big brute is Nimrod," Lily replied calmly. "He guards the entrance to the ninth circle." "Oh, and you're quite right, George. This is hell, the very lowest level, in fact." The revelation was horrifying, and yet I was not entirely surprised. I had seen this ice-covered hellscape many times in my nightmares, and always thought I would end up here. I looked away from Lily and the sulking giant, my eyes drawn to the sickening spectacle of the slaughtered cultists. Looking past the corpses, I saw Cain and what remained of his party, their numbers now reduced to 9. Suddenly, my terror turned to anger as I worked out what had just happened. Striding forward through the ice and snow, I shouted at Cain, confronting him with a righteous fury. "You evil son of a bitch," I exclaimed. "You sent your own people to their deaths. You knew the giant was there waiting for them." Cain didn't even attempt to deny the allegation, as he snarled his response without even a hint of remorse. "The Dark Lord does not tolerate weakness," he answered. "Those who wish to serve him must first prove themselves. My people know this all too well. Only the strongest will survive this journey." I looked into the faces of the anonymous cultists, noting the change from only moments before. Gone were the twisted smiles, now replaced by fearful looks as the cold reality hit home. I turned to see Lily standing behind me, and she merely shrugged her shoulders, not attempting to challenge Cain's assertion. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. Throughout all my journeys, I'd seen how the organization was willing to sacrifice even their most loyal followers. There was nothing we could do for the dead, and going back clearly wasn't an option. And so I had no choice but to join Lily, Kane, and the surviving cultists as we set forth across the plain of ice, struggling under the cold winds and elements. But Kane wasn't quite finished with me yet, as he took the opportunity to whisper a thinly veiled threat into my ear as we walked. You know, George, we have a long way still to go, and many dangers lay along our path. I'd watch your back if I was you. He grinned sadistically and winked, and I experienced a coldness that was nothing to do with the weather. With some difficulty, we marched through the wall of sleet and snow, the sharp cold hitting my skin and causing me physical pain. It was an arduous trek to say the least, but I kept up with the party, not wishing to fall behind and become lost in this icy hellscape. We must have been marching for about 2 hours before we received some light relief, as the snowstorm suddenly cleared and the path before us opened up. Once the storm cleared, we saw a vast plain of ice under a gray sky, with snow-covered hills on the horizon. But the change in weather only provided a temporary relief, as we were exposed to the true horrors of the Ninth Circle. Because as we walked, we saw figures encased in the ice, trapped with the top halves of their bodies above the surface. All were naked and their skin had turned blue, but somehow all were still alive, weakly begging for mercy or a final relief as we passed them. At first there were only a few of the tortured souls, but the further we walked, the more of those wretched people we saw, until eventually it seemed like we were trekking through a twisted forest of frozen victims. My jaw dropped as I looked from side to side in awestruck horror, my ears filled with 100 pain cries. I looked to Lily in disgust, and she simply shook her head and said, "You can't do anything for them, George, and you wouldn't want to if you knew what they'd done. They're sinners, the worst of the worst. That's why they're here." I didn't know whether she was telling the truth about the victims or not. I could still vividly recall the horrific images she'd put into my head, with my own family trapped in the ice, left to freeze in agony for all eternity. We must have passed thousands of these trapped souls, and I was almost driven to insanity by witnessing their unimaginable suffering. The reactions of my companions were telling. Lily seemed indifferent and unaffected, like this was simply a walk in the park for her. Meanwhile, the psychotic Kane grinned inanely as he marched through the hellish scene, occasionally stopping to mock and spit on the victims. This hell was a paradise to a sadist like him. His followers weren't so enthusiastic, however. Some of the cultists feigned their leader's enthusiasm, but I could tell from the looks in their eyes which gave away their true feelings, and others no longer made any attempt to disguise their terror, as clearly they understood Kane had lied to them. But we all kept walking nonetheless, as we were all trapped in this nightmare together. Finally, the sickening forest of victims ended, but once again it was a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire. Once we reached the end of the frozen wasteland, we stepped onto the snow-covered hills, needing to cross them to reach our objective. The climb was physically exerting for all of us and made more difficult by the icy conditions. But there was something else too, a terrible emotion which weighed me down, and I think affected the others too, even the previously giddy Kane. As we climbed higher, I experienced a near-crippling depression and grim foreboding, struggling to go on, but somehow knowing that I must. Once we reached the top of the hill and looked down, we came face to face with what I guessed must be our final destination. Before us stood a twisted structure carved from the ice, a castle of tall and jagged spires, thick walls and battlements, all surrounded by a deep moat, which could only be crossed by a drawbridge. The ice castle was not a structure of architectural beauty, far from it. Instead, the fortress was ugly and intimidating, designed for function and to drum fear into the hearts of all who set eyes upon it. But the physical aspects of the grim structure were only one part of it, because when I looked upon that horrid fortress, I felt something else, something far worse than anything I'd experienced up to this point. In that moment, I was consumed by a primal terror, like an ancient fear buried deep inside of me had suddenly been dragged to the fore. I knew something evil dwelt within those icy walls, and I realized he was watching me. In fact, the beast's eyes had been on me for some time, but now I was in his realm, looking upon his palace and caught within his wicked spell. I realized then that my whole hideous journey had been leading me to this place, ever since Lily had first entrapped me in my office. Hell, maybe he'd been targeting me for my whole life. What chance did I have when faced with such diabolical power? I looked to Lily, hoping for some reassurance or explanation, but instead I noted how she glanced up into the gray skies with a most uncharacteristic look in her wide eyes, one of fear. With considerable reluctance, I followed her eyes upwards and saw the winged terrors soaring through the skies above, white-bodied creatures with sharp claws, long fangs, and burning red eyes that were focused upon us. I counted 5, 10, 15. A horde of murderous flying demons rapidly descending. For a moment we all stood there on the snow-covered hillside, looking up in awestruck horror as the monsters screeched in ravenous anticipation, opening their mighty jaws as they came ever closer. Lily had stopped Nimrod's attack with a single word, but it seemed these white harpies were beyond even her powers. "I can't call them off," she shouted fearfully. "We must run." With that, she took off at tremendous speed, and I only hesitated for a second before following her down the hillside. Soon the entire party were running for their lives, the harpies screeching bloody murder as they were right above our heads. The ice palace, as awful as it seemed, offered our only sanctuary from the aerial attack. But we had a lot of dead ground to cover, and there was no way we'd all make it. I saw the first harpy capture its prey, digging claws and teeth into flesh, before pulling its screaming victim upwards into the hellish sky. The next attack came a moment later, as another screaming cultist was taken. Our mad dash soon turned into a massacre as we were picked off one by one. The drawbridge was so close, but I saw the shadow of the beast and heard its bloodthirsty roar in my ears. I was sure my end was nigh and expected to feel the sharp talons tearing into my flesh at any moment. But then Lily took my hand, dragging me across the threshold with the harpy only inches away. I soon jumped back onto my feet, expecting another attack at any moment. But the harpies abruptly halted their attack, flying back into the gray skies as apparently they weren't able to cross the moat and finish their murderous assault. Standing for a moment, I watched as the harpies ascended, their white wings now stained red with the blood of their victims. Turning around, I observed what was left of our party. Lily looked mournfully up into the sky, seeming to regret the horror which had just occurred. Even Cain seemed shaken by the massacre, maintaining the twisted smile on his blue lips, but with an unbalanced look in his dark eyes. As for the cultists, there were only 4 of them left now, the rest taken by the harpies, their bodies ripped apart and flesh consumed in a hideous feeding frenzy. Perhaps the 4 were the strong ones as Cain had claimed, but when looking at them it certainly didn't seem that way. All appeared broken, exhausted, terrified, and barely holding it together. What had they thought they would get from coming here? What had they expected? I focused on one cultist in particular, a young man, little more than a boy really. He looked at me with wide blue eyes, silently pleading for me to help him. I wanted to speak out but couldn't find the words. We shared a pained look for a moment, but Lily broke the spell as she put a firm hand on my shoulder and said, "Come on, George, the boss is waiting." I took a deep breath before following Lily, Cain, and the others further into the ice castle as we slowly marched towards the heart of darkness. I expected Satan's palace to be full of unspeakable horrors, twisted demons and tortured souls, but instead it was all but abandoned. We trekked cautiously through an empty courtyard, wearily watching the battlements high above as we expected another attack at any moment. But there were no signs of life in this desolate place. Upon crossing the courtyard, Lily led us into a tunnel of ice which led downwards into the guts of the frozen ground. The passageway was dimly lit, bitterly cold and very foreboding. But the worst thing was the terrible sounds which reverberated through the narrow tunnel. faint at first but growing ever louder the deeper we descended into the earth. We all heard the screams, the pained cries of so many damned souls suffering unimaginable tortures. And above all, the screaming was a cruel, sadistic cackle emitted by the greatest evil in creation. I knew who was waiting for me at the end of that long corridor of ice. What I didn't know was what this monster intended to do to me, but I would soon discover the awful truth. We exited the tunnel and entered a vast chamber carved from the ice, with the ceiling adorned with stalactites 100 foot above our heads. The space was huge but not entirely empty, with the only visible feature being a crude throne of ugly iron in the room's center. And upon it sat our host, small in comparison to the chamber, but somehow still filling the space with his chilling stare and booming, godlike voice. "My loyal followers, come and bow before me. Now is the time to show your fealty." Lily led the way, gliding across the ice and bowing down before her master. Cain soon followed, showing his submission by taking the knee. The rest of us were more reluctant, but the fear pulled us forward, as none of us could resist the Dark Lord's wicked power. As we approached, I could see the monster in all his terrible glory, and what surprised me was how ordinary he looked. The dark entity sitting upon the Iron Throne took the form of a man. He wore a finely tailored black suit and was noticeably handsome, sporting a neatly trimmed beard and flashing a set of pearly white teeth. On the surface, he looked like a politician or company CEO, but this appearance was only surface deep, and as always, it was the eyes which gave him away. Those eyes full of malice, rage, and a dark power which drew me in. I couldn't look away from him and felt like I'd lost control of my body and mind as I got down on my knees and bowed before him. There was no doubt who this entity was. Lucifer, Satan, the devil, Lord of the Flies. Officially, this was the first time I'd met him, but I instantly recognized the devil, swearing that I'd seen him before, more than once. He'd been following me for some time, maybe for my whole life, and now he had me like a fly caught in his web. "Lily, Cain, welcome back," Lucifer said with a wicked grin etched on his lips. "What have you brought for me this time?" I wondered what Lucifer was referring to until I noted how he looked down on me and the surviving cultists, eyeing us up like we were pieces of meat. I remained frozen on my knees, averting my eyes from the beast as Lily pointed towards me and made introductions. "My lord, this is George Walsh, your newest servant. He has made a significant contribution to our cause in recent weeks." Lucifer replied thoughtfully without making further comment. He glared at me for a moment before turning towards the four cultists. "And these wretches?" he asked. "An offering, my lord," Cain replied ominously. "Well, it is lunchtime," Lucifer answered with a sadistic glee. What happened next was both breathtaking and horrific. Lucifer transformed in front of our very eyes, growing rapidly in size in mere seconds, his suit ripping, skin turning to scales, and 2 additional heads bursting out from his shoulders. Suddenly I realized why the chamber was so large, because the beast filled up the space and sprawled across the icy floor. It all happened so fast, but what emerged was a monster from the worst of my nightmares, a leviathan in the shape of a serpent but with 3 heads, a trio of fang-filled maws and 6 eyes burning a demonic red. The monster roared with a predatory zeal before launching itself forward, grabbing 3 of the screaming cultists in its trio of mouths, jaws snapping as Lucifer bit deep into flesh and bone. Cain watched unemotionally as his people were devoured, and I realized it had always been his intention to sacrifice his followers to Lucifer. It was a sickening spectacle, but soon ended as the beast finished his meal and turned back to us with his eyes burning red. I stood frozen in terror beside the last remaining cultist, the young man I'd locked eyes with on the drawbridge. Why had he been spared, I soon found out. Lily stepped forward to be by my side, as Lucifer retained his monstrous form and watched over us, and the young cultist stayed on his knees, trembling in terror, whilst his teary eyes pleaded for mercy. Meanwhile, Lily deftly removed an item from under her dress. I looked down in horror, seeing the sharp dagger she held in her steady hand. She offered it to me whilst nodding to the terrified cult member at our feet. "This one is for you, George," she whispered. "You need to finish him, to bound with us in blood." I turned to Lily in disgust and disbelief, shaking my head in the negative. "No," I mouthed. "No, I can't do it." "You must," Lily answered firmly. "He is watching. If you fail, your family's souls are forfeit." I knew what she was referring to, remembering all too well the vile images she'd put in my head the first time we met. I realized that my loved ones would end up in the field of ice with all the rest, trapped and tortured for all eternity. Once again they had me, and what choice did I have? I took the dagger with a shaking hand, staring at the weapon for a long moment like I couldn't believe this was really happening. Next I looked down upon my would-be victim. It was the strangest thing, but the kid didn't run or even beg for his life. Instead, he simply remained on his knees, trembling uncontrollably and looking up at me with pitiful eyes. I paused for only a second, not thinking of the consequences or the day after, only of my family and what would happen to them if I refused. I lashed out with all my strength, plunging the blade deep into my victim's throat and watching as the blood squirted out like a fountain. I stabbed him again and again, cutting into my victim's body and covering the blue ice with crimson blood. All my self-control was gone, and it took Lily to pull me back. She physically dragged me off my victim and took hold of the blood-soaked knife. And then she held me, ignoring the monstrous Lucifer in that moment as she whispered softly in my ear. "It's okay, George. It's over. You're with us now, for all eternity." And my heart sank because I knew I'd lost my soul forever. This is my ugly, tragic story from beginning to end. I know now that I never stood a chance. I can't even blame Lily for my fall. Sure, she played her part, but I was weak and the darkness had always dwelt within me. I think I was always doomed, long before she first stepped into my office. And now I do their bidding 24/7, working with other satanic servants while sacrificing the foolish and greedy to the Dark Lord. This is my fate, and there's no escape for me. As for you, dear readers, all I can offer is sage advice. Don't ever come into my office and never book on one of my tours. Because once you set foot on hell's shores, there's no way back.